The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base as Lieutenant Sarah Chen walked through the corridor toward Admiral Morrison's office. Her dress uniform was perfectly pressed, every button gleaming, but beneath the crisp fabric, her ribs ached with each breath. She had been summoning the courage for this meeting for weeks, knowing that what she was about to reveal could either save her career or destroy it completely. Sarah had joined the Navy 5 years ago with dreams of serving her country and proving that women belonged in every corner of the military. She excelled in her training, graduated at the top of her class, and earned respect from her peers through dedication and skill. But 6 months ago, everything changed when she was assigned to work under Commander Jake Stevens aboard the USS Vigilant. Stevens was a decorated officer with 20 years of service and a reputation for being tough but fair. However, Sarah quickly discovered that his public persona masked something much darker. It started with inappropriate comments during briefings, remarks about how women didn't belong on combat ships, and suggestions that she had only earned her position through special treatment rather than merit. When Sarah tried to address his behavior through proper channels, filing complaints with her immediate supervisors, she was told that Stevens was just old school and that she needed to develop thicker skin. The harassment escalated when Stevens began finding reasons to call her to his quarters for late-night meetings about routine paperwork. These sessions became increasingly uncomfortable as he made physical advances that Sarah firmly rejected. The situation reached a breaking point 3 weeks ago during a training exercise off the coast of California. Sarah had been working in the engine room when Stevens appeared, claiming he needed to inspect her work personally. The space was cramped and isolated, with the nearest crew members several decks away. Stevens cornered her against the machinery, his intentions clear. Sarah fought back with everything she had learned in combat training, but Stevens was larger and stronger. The struggle was brief but violent. When she managed to break free and escape, her ribs were bruised and her uniform torn. Stevens threatened her career if she reported the incident, reminding her that he had connections throughout the Navy and that no one would believe her word over his. For days afterward, Sarah wrestled with what to do. She knew that reporting sexual assault in the military was complicated and often resulted in retaliation against the victim. She had seen other women transfer out quietly rather than face the scrutiny and potential damage to their careers. But Sarah also knew that staying silent meant Stevens would likely target other women. The physical pain from her injuries served as a constant reminder of what had happened. Every time she put on her uniform, she felt the fabric against her bruised ribs. Every time she saw Stevens in the corridors or during briefings, she felt a mixture of fear and anger that made her hands shake. She began having trouble sleeping, startling awake at night with the memory of being trapped in that engine room. Sarah's best friend and fellow officer, Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez, noticed the changes in her behavior. Maria had known Sarah since their academy days and recognized that something was seriously wrong. After several attempts to get Sarah to open up, Maria finally confronted her directly about what had happened. The conversation took place in Sarah's quarters late one evening. Maria sat on the small desk chair while Sarah paced nervously near the porthole, struggling to find the words. When she finally told Maria about the assault, her friend's face went through a series of emotions: shock, anger, and then determination. Maria urged Sarah to report the incident immediately, offering to accompany her to speak with the appropriate authorities. She reminded Sarah of their oath to protect not just their country, but also each other. Maria also pointed out that Stevens' behavior was likely not isolated to just one incident or one victim. After much deliberation, Sarah decided to take her case directly to Admiral Morrison, the base commander. Morrison had a reputation for being fair and taking sexual assault allegations seriously. However, Sarah also knew that Admiral Morrison and Commander Stevens had served together years ago and maintained a professional friendship that could complicate the situation. The decision to meet with Admiral Morrison required Sarah to gather evidence and prepare her statement carefully. She documented every incident she could remember, including dates, times, and any witnesses who might have observed Stevens' inappropriate behavior. She also took photographs of her injuries, though the bruises were already beginning to fade. Sarah spent hours researching military regulations regarding sexual assault reporting and familiarizing herself with her rights as a victim. She knew that once she made the formal report, there would be an investigation that could become very public within the naval community. Her personal life would be scrutinized, and Stevens would likely attempt to discredit her testimony. The night before her meeting with Admiral Morrison, Sarah barely slept. She reviewed her notes repeatedly and practiced what she would say. She knew that this conversation would be one of the most important of her life, potentially affecting not just her own future, but also setting a precedent for how such cases were handled on the base. As she walked toward the Admiral's office that morning, Sarah carried with her a folder containing her formal complaint, supporting documentation, and medical records from the base hospital, where she had been treated for her injuries. She had not mentioned the cause of her injuries to the medical staff, claiming they were from a training accident, but the records would serve as proof of what Stevens had done to her. The corridor seemed longer than usual as Sarah approached the heavy wooden door marked with Admiral Morrison's nameplate. She could hear voices inside. The Admiral was finishing up another meeting. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the familiar ache in her ribs, and reminded herself why she was there. This wasn't just about seeking justice for herself. It was about protecting other women who might become Stevens' targets. A secretary emerged from the office, followed by two junior officers who nodded respectfully to Sarah as they passed. The secretary checked her appointment book and gestured for Sarah to enter. Admiral Morrison's office was impressive, with flags, commendations, and photographs documenting his distinguished career covering the walls. The Admiral himself sat behind a large mahogany desk, reviewing documents. Admiral Morrison looked up as Sarah entered, his weathered face showing the experience of 3 decades in the Navy. He gestured to the chair across from his desk and asked her to sit. Sarah remained standing for a moment, gathering her courage for what she was about to do. She knew that once she spoke, there would be no going back. Admiral Morrison gestured for Sarah to take a seat, but she remained standing, her hands clasped behind her back in perfect military posture. The Admiral studied her face, noting the tension in her jaw and the way her shoulders seemed rigid despite her professional demeanor. He had seen that look before in young officers carrying heavy burdens. "Lieutenant Chen," Admiral Morrison began, his voice carrying the authority of decades in command, "your request for this meeting indicated you had something urgent to discuss. Please sit down and tell me what's on your mind." Sarah finally took the seat across from his desk, placing her folder carefully on her lap. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, but now, facing the Admiral directly, her carefully prepared words seemed inadequate. The office felt smaller than she had expected, despite its impressive size and formal atmosphere. "Sir, I need to report a serious incident involving Commander Stevens," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "3 weeks ago, during the training exercise aboard the USS Vigilant, Commander Stevens sexually assaulted me." The Admiral's expression didn't change immediately, but Sarah noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, studying her face carefully. She knew he was evaluating her credibility, looking for signs of deception or emotional instability that might undermine her claim. "That's a very serious allegation, Lieutenant," Admiral Morrison said slowly. "I need you to walk me through exactly what happened in as much detail as you're comfortable providing." Sarah opened her folder and removed her written statement, though she had memorized every word. She began with the months of harassment leading up to the assault, the inappropriate comments, the uncomfortable meetings, and the escalating pattern of behavior that had made her increasingly uncomfortable serving under Stevens' command. As she spoke, Admiral Morrison took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates, locations, and potential witnesses. His questions were professional and respectful, but Sarah could sense the weight of the situation settling over both of them. They both knew that these allegations, if proven true, would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. When Sarah reached the part about the actual assault in the engine room, she found herself speaking more slowly, choosing her words carefully. The Admiral's pen stopped moving as he listened intently to her description of the attack and her escape. The silence in the office was profound when she finished speaking. "Lieutenant, you mentioned that you sustained injuries during this incident," Admiral Morrison said after a long pause. "Did you seek medical attention?" Sarah nodded, pulling out copies of her medical records. "Yes, sir. I was treated at the base hospital, though I told them the injuries were from a training accident. I was afraid of the complications that would arise if I reported the true cause at that time." Admiral Morrison reviewed the medical records, noting the documentation of bruised ribs and other injuries consistent with Sarah's account. He set the papers down and looked directly at her, his expression grave but not unsympathetic. "Lieutenant, I want you to understand that making a formal complaint will trigger an investigation that will be thorough and potentially difficult for everyone involved. Are you prepared for that process?" Sarah had expected this question and had spent many sleepless nights considering the answer. "Sir, I understand the implications, but I believe it's my duty to report this incident. Commander Stevens is in a position of authority, and if his behavior goes unchecked, other women may become victims." The Admiral nodded slowly, appreciating her reasoning even as he grappled with the complexity of the situation. Jake Stevens was not just any officer. He was someone Morrison had known for years, someone whose career he had watched develop with interest and approval. The allegations were forcing him to reconcile his personal knowledge of Stevens with the serious claims being made by a junior officer he barely knew. "Lieutenant, I need to ask you directly, is there any personal animosity between you and Commander Stevens that might be influencing this complaint? Any professional conflicts or disputes that could be relevant to this situation?" Sarah had anticipated this question as well, knowing that Stevens would likely claim she was making false accusations out of spite or ambition. "No, sir. My only conflicts with Commander Stevens have been related to his inappropriate behavior toward me. I have no personal grievances beyond what I've reported." Admiral Morrison made more notes, then set his pen down and looked directly at Sarah. "Lieutenant, what you're alleging represents a serious breach of military conduct and criminal behavior. If you're certain of your facts and committed to pursuing this complaint, I will initiate the proper investigative procedures immediately." "I am certain, sir," Sarah replied without hesitation. The Admiral opened his desk drawer and removed several forms, explaining the formal complaint process and Sarah's rights as a victim under military law. As he spoke, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that she was finally taking action, but apprehension about the difficult road ahead. "There's something else I need to discuss with you," Admiral Morrison continued. "Given the nature of these allegations and the fact that you're currently serving under Commander Stevens' command, we need to address your immediate duty assignment. I can arrange for a temporary transfer while the investigation is conducted." Sarah hadn't considered this possibility, but she immediately saw the wisdom in it. Continuing to work under Stevens while the investigation proceeded would be impossible for everyone involved. She agreed to the temporary transfer, understanding that it might raise questions among her colleagues about why she was being moved. Admiral Morrison explained the next steps in the process. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service would be contacted to conduct a formal investigation. Sarah would be interviewed again by trained investigators, and Stevens would be notified of the allegations and given an opportunity to respond. The process could take weeks or even months, depending on the complexity of the case and the evidence uncovered. "Lieutenant, I want to be clear about something," Admiral Morrison said, his tone becoming more personal. "Sexual assault allegations are taken very seriously in today's Navy. You will not face retaliation for making this report, and anyone who attempts to retaliate against you will face serious consequences." Sarah appreciated his assurance, though she knew that preventing retaliation was often easier said than done. Military communities were small and close-knit, and word of her allegations would inevitably spread throughout the base. Some people would support her courage in coming forward, while others might view her with suspicion or resentment. As their meeting continued, Admiral Morrison asked about Sarah's support system and encouraged her to take advantage of counseling services available through the base chaplain or mental health professionals. He also provided her with contact information for victim advocacy programs that could help her navigate the investigation process. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, covering every aspect of Sarah's allegations and the procedures that would follow. By the time it concluded, Sarah felt emotionally drained but also strangely relieved. The burden she had been carrying alone for weeks was now shared with someone in a position to take action. As Sarah prepared to leave, Admiral Morrison stood and walked around his desk to face her directly. "Lieutenant Chen, what you've done today took considerable courage. Regardless of what the investigation determines, you should be proud of your willingness to come forward and report these serious allegations." Sarah thanked the Admiral and gathered her folder, which now contained copies of all the forms she had completed and signed. As she walked toward the door, she felt the familiar ache in her ribs, a reminder of what had brought her to this moment. But for the first time in weeks, that pain was accompanied by a sense of hope that justice might be possible. 3 days after Sarah's meeting with Admiral Morrison, the investigation officially began. Special Agent Rebecca Torres from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service arrived at the base to conduct interviews and gather evidence. Torres was a seasoned investigator with 15 years of experience handling sexual assault cases in the military, and her reputation for thoroughness and fairness preceded her. Sarah's first formal interview with Agent Torres took place in a private conference room away from the main administrative buildings. Torres explained that this conversation would be recorded and that Sarah should take her time answering each question completely and honestly. The agent's professional but compassionate demeanor helped put Sarah somewhat at ease, though discussing the assault in such detail remained emotionally difficult. During the 3-hour interview, Torres asked Sarah to recount not just the specific incident in the engine room, but also the pattern of harassment that had preceded it. The agent was particularly interested in any witnesses who might have observed Stephen's inappropriate behavior or Sarah's distress following various encounters with him. Sarah mentioned several instances where other crew members had been present during Stephen's inappropriate comments, including Petty Officer Williams, who had witnessed Stevens making remarks about women's capabilities during a briefing. She also recalled Chief Martinez overhearing Stevens suggest that Sarah had only earned her position through affirmative action rather than merit. Agent Torres took detailed notes and asked Sarah to provide contact information for these potential witnesses. The investigator explained that corroborating testimony would be crucial in building a case, since sexual assault often occurred in private settings with no direct witnesses to the actual crime. Following Sarah's interview, Agent Torres began the delicate process of interviewing other crew members who had served with both Sarah and Stevens. These interviews had to be conducted carefully to gather information without revealing the specific nature of the investigation, at least initially. Petty Officer Williams confirmed that he had heard Stevens make inappropriate comments about female officers on multiple occasions. Williams described Stevens as someone who seemed to believe that women were fundamentally unsuited for military service, particularly in combat roles. The petty officer admitted that he had been uncomfortable with Stevens' remarks, but hadn't known how to address them given the commander's senior rank. Chief Martinez provided similar testimony, recounting several instances where Stevens had questioned Sarah's qualifications in front of other crew members. Martinez noted that Stevens seemed to single out Sarah for criticism more than other junior officers, and that his comments often had a personal rather than professional tone. These witness interviews began to establish a pattern of discriminatory behavior that supported Sarah's allegations of harassment. However, Agent Torres knew that proving the actual assault would be more challenging, since it had occurred in private and Stevens would undoubtedly deny the allegations. Meanwhile, Commander Stevens had been notified of the investigation and the general nature of the allegations against him. His initial reaction was one of shock and indignation. Stevens immediately contacted a military attorney and began preparing his defense. He maintained his innocence and suggested that Sarah was making false accusations due to poor performance evaluations he had given her. Stevens' attorney advised him to avoid any contact with Sarah or potential witnesses and to document any evidence that might support his version of events. The commander began compiling Sarah's performance records, looking for evidence of professional shortcomings that might provide an alternative motive for her allegations. Agent Torres' investigation expanded to include a thorough review of both officers' personnel files. Sarah's record showed consistent excellence in her duties, with strong performance evaluations from previous commanders and commendations for her technical expertise. Her file contained no disciplinary actions or complaints about her conduct. Stevens' file was more complex. While he had received good evaluations overall, Torres noticed several comments from previous superiors about his old-fashioned attitudes toward female personnel. One evaluation from 3 years earlier specifically mentioned that Stevens needed to adapt his leadership style to work more effectively with the changing demographics of today's Navy. The investigator also discovered that Stevens had been counseled informally 2 years earlier about complaints from female crew members regarding his comments about women in the military. While no formal action had been taken, the incident had been documented in his personnel file as a development area for improvement. As the investigation progressed, Agent Torres interviewed Sarah's friend Lieutenant Rodriguez, who provided important testimony about Sarah's emotional state following the assault. Rodriguez described how Sarah's behavior had changed dramatically after returning from the training exercise, noting increased anxiety, difficulty sleeping, and reluctance to discuss her work assignments. Rodriguez also testified about Sarah's eventual disclosure of the assault and her anguish over whether to report it. This testimony helped establish that Sarah's allegations were not a recent fabrication, but had been consistent over time, and reported to a trusted friend shortly after the incident occurred. The medical evidence proved to be another crucial element of the investigation. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, the physician who had treated Sarah's injuries at the base hospital, was interviewed about her observations and findings. While Sarah had claimed the injuries resulted from a training accident, Dr. Hayes noted that the pattern of bruising was more consistent with an altercation than an accidental fall or collision with equipment. Dr. Hayes testified that she had found Sarah's explanation somewhat suspicious at the time, but had not pursued the matter further since patients sometimes minimized the circumstances of their injuries. The physician's professional observations provided additional support for Sarah's version of events. Agent Torres also conducted a detailed examination of the engine room where the alleged assault had occurred. She documented the layout of the space, noting how isolated it was from other areas of the ship and how someone could become trapped in the narrow passages between machinery. The physical evidence supported Sarah's description of how the assault had unfolded. Throughout this process, Sarah continued her duties at her temporary assignment, working in the base's communications center. The change of pace was welcome, as she no longer had to worry about encountering Stevens or dealing with the stress of serving under his command. However, she was aware that rumors about her transfer were circulating, and some people seemed to be treating her differently. Admiral Morrison received regular briefings on the investigation's progress and was impressed by Agent Torres' thoroughness. The Admiral found himself in the difficult position of remaining impartial while dealing with the fallout from the allegations. He had known Stevens for years and found it hard to reconcile the accusations with his personal knowledge of the man, yet he was committed to ensuring that justice was served regardless of personal relationships. As the investigation entered its third week, Agent Torres prepared to interview Commander Stevens directly. This would be the most critical interview of the entire process, as Stevens would have the opportunity to provide his account of events and respond to the specific allegations against him. Stevens' attorney had advised him to be cooperative but cautious, answering questions directly while avoiding any statements that might be used against him. The commander maintained his position that the allegations were false and that Sarah was motivated by professional grievances rather than actual misconduct on his part. The interview with Stevens was scheduled to take place in Admiral Morrison's conference room, with both Stevens and his attorney present along with Agent Torres. The session would be recorded, and a stenographer would create a written transcript of all statements made. Sarah knew that Stevens' interview was approaching and felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. She understood that his testimony could either support or contradict her allegations, and that the investigation's outcome might depend heavily on Agent Torres' assessment of both their credibility. The investigation was reaching a crucial phase where all the evidence would be evaluated and a determination made about whether charges should be filed. Sarah tried to focus on her work and avoid speculation about the outcome, but she couldn't help wondering what Stevens might say in his defense and how the investigation would ultimately conclude. Commander Stevens entered Admiral Morrison's conference room with his attorney, Captain Frank Mitchell, flanking him. The atmosphere was tense as Agent Torres set up her recording equipment and prepared to conduct what would be the most important interview of the investigation. Stevens maintained his military bearing, but there was a noticeable strain in his expression as he took his seat across from the investigator. Agent Torres began with standard procedural questions about Stevens' background and service record before moving to the specific allegations. She asked him to describe his professional relationship with Lieutenant Chen and address the claims of harassment that had been made against him. Stevens responded that he had always maintained appropriate professional relationships with all personnel under his command, including Lieutenant Chen. He acknowledged that he sometimes used what he called direct language when addressing performance issues, but denied that his interactions with Sarah had ever been inappropriate or discriminatory. When Agent Torres asked about specific incidents that witnesses had described, Stevens provided alternative explanations for each situation. He claimed that his comments about women in the military were taken out of context, and that he had been discussing legitimate concerns about physical standards rather than making discriminatory statements. Regarding the alleged assault in the engine room, Stevens categorically denied that any such incident had occurred. He claimed to have no recollection of even being in that area of the ship during the time frame Sarah had specified. His attorney had advised him to be brief and definitive in his denials while avoiding detailed explanations that might contain inconsistencies. Agent Torres pressed Stevens about his whereabouts during the training exercise, asking for specific details about his duties and movements throughout the relevant time period. Stevens provided a general overview of his responsibilities as commanding officer, but claimed he could not recall the specific details of his location at every moment during the multi-day exercise. The investigator also questioned Stevens about his knowledge of Sarah's injuries following the training exercise. Stevens acknowledged that he had been aware she had been treated for injuries, but claimed he had accepted the explanation that they resulted from a training accident. He denied any knowledge that the injuries might have been sustained during an assault. As the interview progressed, Stevens became increasingly defensive, particularly when Agent Torres questioned him about the previous complaints regarding his treatment of female personnel. He dismissed these earlier incidents as misunderstandings and suggested that some women in the military were overly sensitive to normal military discipline and leadership. This line of questioning revealed an attitude that Agent Torres found concerning. Stevens seemed to believe that complaints from female personnel were inherently less credible than those from male service members, and he showed little understanding of how his behavior might have created a hostile work environment. When Agent Torres asked Stevens directly whether he had ever made unwanted physical contact with Lieutenant Chen, he emphatically denied the allegation. However, his attorney quickly intervened to clarify that Stevens would not be answering any additional questions about the specific assault allegations without further consultation. The interview concluded after nearly 4 hours, with Stevens maintaining his innocence throughout. Agent Torres found his denials to be somewhat rehearsed and noted several instances where his explanations seemed inconsistent with testimony from other witnesses. However, she also recognized that denial was a natural response to serious allegations and that inconsistencies didn't necessarily prove guilt. Following Stevens' interview, Agent Torres spent several days reviewing all the evidence she had gathered. The case presented the typical challenges of sexual assault investigations: competing versions of events, limited physical evidence, and the difficulty of proving what had occurred in private between two individuals. However, the pattern of corroborating evidence was compelling. Multiple witnesses had testified about Stevens' inappropriate comments and discriminatory behavior toward Sarah. The medical evidence supported Sarah's account of sustaining injuries during the alleged timeframe. Most importantly, Sarah's testimony had remained consistent throughout multiple interviews, and her friend's testimony established that she had reported the assault shortly after it occurred. Agent Torres also considered the credibility of both parties. Sarah had no apparent motive to fabricate such serious allegations, particularly given the potential damage to her own career. Her service record was exemplary, and she had demonstrated integrity throughout her military service. Stevens, while having a generally good service record, had a documented history of problems with female personnel that supported the pattern of behavior Sarah had described. The investigator prepared her preliminary findings for Admiral Morrison, outlining the evidence for and against the allegations. While the case would ultimately be decided by military prosecutors, and possibly a court-martial, Agent Torres' assessment would carry significant weight in determining how to proceed. Meanwhile, word of the investigation had begun to spread throughout the base despite efforts to maintain confidentiality. Some personnel strongly supported Sarah, viewing her as courageous for coming forward against a powerful superior. Others remained skeptical, wondering why she had waited weeks to report the alleged assault and questioning her motives. Sarah found herself caught in the middle of these divided opinions. Some colleagues went out of their way to show support, while others seemed to avoid her entirely. She realized that regardless of the investigation's outcome, The allegations had permanently changed how she would be viewed by some members of the naval community. Lieutenant Rodriguez remained Sarah's strongest supporter, often staying with her during off-duty hours and helping her cope with the stress of the ongoing investigation. Rodriguez had seen firsthand how the alleged assault had affected her friend and was determined to see justice served. Admiral Morrison found himself grappling with the complex emotions surrounding the case. He had hoped that Agent Tor's investigation would provide clear answers, but like many sexual assault cases, the evidence was strong but not conclusive. He would have to make difficult decisions about Stephen's future regardless of whether formal charges were filed. The Admiral was particularly troubled by the pattern of behavior that the investigation had revealed. Even if Stevens had not committed assault, his documented treatment of female personnel suggested leadership failures that could not be ignored. Morrison realized that the case would have implications far beyond the specific allegations, potentially requiring a broader examination of command climate and gender relations on the base. As Agent Torres finalized her report, she reflected on the challenges of investigating sexual assault in military settings. The hierarchical structure that made military organizations effective also created opportunities for abuse of power. Even when victims found the courage to come forward, proving their allegations often required overcoming institutional biases and the natural tendency to protect established leaders. The investigation had taken a month to complete, during which time both Sarah and Stevens had continued their duties while dealing with the stress and uncertainty of the pending outcome. The base had operated normally on the surface, but the underlying tension was palpable among those who knew about the allegations. Agent Torres scheduled a final meeting with Admiral Morrison to present her findings and recommendations. This meeting would determine whether the case would proceed to court-martial, result in administrative action, or be resolved through alternative means. The decision would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved and would send a message about how seriously the Navy took sexual assault allegations. Sarah waited anxiously for word about the investigation's outcome, knowing that her future in the military might depend on whether the evidence was deemed sufficient to proceed with formal charges. She had done everything she could to support the investigation and now had to trust that the system would work as intended to deliver justice. Agent Torres entered Admiral Morrison's office carrying a thick file that represented weeks of intensive investigation. The Admiral gestured for her to sit across from his desk, the same chair where Sarah had sat a month earlier when she first made her allegations. The weight of the moment was not lost on either of them as they prepared to discuss findings that would determine the fate of two naval officers. "Agent Torres," Admiral Morrison began, "I've been waiting for your assessment. What did your investigation reveal?" Torres opened her file and extracted her carefully prepared summary. "Admiral, this case presents the complexities typical of sexual assault allegations, but I believe the evidence supports Lieutenant Chen's account of events. While we cannot definitively prove every detail of her allegations, the pattern of corroborating evidence is compelling." She proceeded to outline her key findings methodically. The testimony from multiple witnesses established Stevens' pattern of discriminatory behavior toward female personnel. The medical evidence supported Sarah's claim of being injured during the timeframe she specified. Most significantly, Sarah's account had remained consistent throughout multiple interviews, and her disclosure to a friend shortly after the alleged incident demonstrated that her allegations were not fabricated after the fact. Admiral Morrison listened intently as Torres described the weaknesses in Stevens' defense. His denials lacked specific details that would be expected from someone truthfully recounting their activities. His explanation of his whereabouts during the crucial time period was vague and could not be corroborated. Additionally, his attitude during the interview revealed troubling perspectives about female service members that supported the pattern of behavior Sarah had described. "What about Stevens' service record?" Admiral Morrison asked. "He's been an effective officer for 20 years. Torres nodded, acknowledging the complexity this added to the case. "That's true, Admiral, but effectiveness in some areas doesn't preclude misconduct in others. Our investigation revealed previous informal counseling about his treatment of female personnel, suggesting this wasn't an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern." The Admiral reviewed Agent Torres' written report, noting the thoroughness of her investigation and the careful analysis of competing evidence. He was particularly struck by her assessment that Sarah had no apparent motive to fabricate such serious allegations, especially given the potential damage to her own career and the difficulty of proving sexual assault cases. "What are your recommendations regarding how to proceed?" Admiral Morrison asked. Torres had anticipated this question and had given it considerable thought. "Admiral, I recommend that this case be referred for court-martial proceedings. While sexual assault cases are always challenging to prosecute, I believe there is sufficient evidence to support the charges. Additionally, the pattern of discriminatory behavior that we've documented warrants formal disciplinary action regardless of the assault allegations." Admiral Morrison appreciated Torres' direct assessment, though he knew that implementing her recommendations would be controversial. Proceeding with court-martial would subject both Sarah and Stevens to intense scrutiny, and the outcome would be uncertain despite the evidence Torres had gathered. The Admiral also had to consider the broader implications for base morale and the Navy's commitment to addressing sexual assault. High-profile cases like this one sent important messages about how seriously such allegations were taken and whether victims could expect justice when they came forward. After Torres left his office, Admiral Morrison spent several hours reviewing the complete investigation file and consulting with his legal advisors about the options for proceeding. The evidence clearly supported some form of disciplinary action against Stevens, but the question was whether court-martial was the appropriate venue or whether alternative measures might achieve better results. That evening, Admiral Morrison called Sarah to his office to inform her of the investigation's findings. When she arrived, he could see the anxiety in her expression as she wondered what conclusions had been reached. The past month had been emotionally exhausting as she waited for validation that her allegations were being taken seriously. "Lieutenant Chen," Admiral Morrison began, "I want to inform you that Agent Torres has completed her investigation and concluded that your allegations are supported by the evidence. I have decided to refer this case for court-martial proceedings against Commander Stevens." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at this news. Relief that the evidence had been deemed sufficient to proceed with formal charges, but apprehension about the difficult legal process that lay ahead. She knew that testifying at court-martial would require her to relive the assault in detail before military judges and potentially a jury of Stevens' peers. Admiral Morrison explained the court-martial process and assured Sarah that she would receive support from victim advocates throughout the proceedings. He emphasized that the decision to proceed was based on the evidence and the military's commitment to addressing sexual assault, not on personal considerations about either officer involved. "Sir, I want to thank you for taking my allegations seriously and ensuring they were investigated thoroughly," Sarah said. "I know this wasn't easy given your relationship with Commander Stevens." The Admiral nodded, acknowledging the personal difficulty of the situation. "Lieutenant, seeking justice sometimes requires making hard decisions about people we thought we knew well. Your courage in coming forward has ensured that the truth could be investigated properly." Meanwhile, Stevens was notified that he was being charged with sexual assault and related offenses under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. His attorney had expected this possibility, but Stevens himself was stunned that the allegations had been deemed credible enough to warrant court-martial. He continued to maintain his innocence and prepared to fight the charges vigorously. The announcement of the court-martial sent ripples throughout the naval base. Some personnel expressed support for Sarah's courage in coming forward, while others questioned whether the allegations were sufficient to justify such serious charges. The case became a focal point for broader discussions about sexual assault in the military and the challenges faced by women in traditionally male-dominated environments. As news of the case spread, Sarah received both support and criticism from various quarters. Some female personnel privately thanked her for taking a stand against sexual harassment, while others worried that her allegations might create a backlash against all women in the service. Sarah tried to focus on the legal process ahead rather than the diverse opinions about her decision to come forward. The court-martial was scheduled to take place in 6 weeks, allowing time for both sides to prepare their cases. Sarah met regularly with prosecutors and victim advocates to prepare her testimony and understand what to expect during the proceedings. The process was challenging, but helped her feel more confident about her ability to present her case effectively. Lieutenant Rodriguez continued to provide crucial emotional support throughout this period. often reminding Sarah that she had done the right thing regardless of the ultimate outcome. Rodriguez had seen the devastating impact of the assault on her friend and remained committed to helping her seek justice. As the court-martial date approached, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 4 months earlier, she had been a dedicated naval officer focused on serving her country and advancing her career. The assault had changed everything, forcing her to navigate complex legal and emotional challenges she had never anticipated. However, Sarah also realized that her experience had given her a deeper understanding of the obstacles faced by women in the military and the importance of holding leaders accountable for their actions. Regardless of the court-martial outcome, she had already accomplished something significant by ensuring that Stephen's behavior was investigated and that other women would be protected from similar treatment. On the morning of the court-martial, Sarah put on her dress uniform and prepared to testify about the most traumatic experience of her military career. She was nervous but determined to tell her story truthfully and completely. As she walked toward the courthouse, she thought about all the women who had supported her throughout this process and drew strength from their encouragement. Admiral Morrison watched from his office window as Sarah made her way to the courthouse, reflecting on the courage it had taken for her to come forward and pursue justice. The court-martial would determine Stephen's guilt or innocence, but Sarah had already demonstrated that the military's commitment to addressing sexual assault was more than empty rhetoric. Her willingness to speak truth to power had ensured that justice could be pursued, and that was a victory in itself, regardless of the final verdict.